our title slide here is Secondary Witnesses. And that makes me ask some questions. What are witnesses before we even know which ones are primary and secondary and tertiary? What do we mean by witnesses here as we talk about looking back to the text, what we might call the original writings? Okay, Fred.
So witnesses would be documents or parts of documents that are not the original, but they're a copy or maybe a copy of a copy.
Great. So less so like someone quoted it and more so it was written down is what and I may have to back up. John may have to correct me on that. But anyways, we're not going to talk about the secondary. What do we call the original? The original one that was written by the prophet, apostle, or other. Scott. Oh, close. 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 I mean, these are words in the discussion. What do we do at the end of our, Fred? Autographs. The autographs is the term that we use for that original one, that first one that the prophet himself put his pen to. Yeah, good. And then, of course, that would have had to been copied. And then what we have today, we look at as witnessing to what the original said. So you can see already we're in a mindset of making sure that we have what the original was. And how do we determine that? Okay. Great. So, Septuagint. Who talked about this at lunch at work this week? Nobody? Oh, no. No, nobody did. That's right. None of us did. What do we know about the Septuagint? When we say, what is the Septuagint? What are some of the things that come to your mind? 70. All right. So we even have some Roman numerals that represent Septuagint. Good. And what does the 70 refer to?
The story that there are 70 particular translators who translated the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek. Or the Pentateuch, at least.
70 translators, roughly, maybe 72. Good. What else? What else do we know about what is the Septuagint? Anything we know about, anything at all that we know about the Septuagint? Okay, it was a major piece. Okay, so it's a major, I'm going to say factor in, I don't even know how to say that. Major translation. And a major witness. I hate writing on the board. It takes forever. And I'm not good at it.
Micah said some more stuff.
Micah, what is the more stuff you said?
Let me think. Hebrew mentioned that it was translation into Greek from the Hebrew.
Great. Timing of Septuagint was roughly I want to say 2nd century BC. We may correct that as we go through our slides here, but somewhere in there. Anything else we know about the Septuagint? This is fun. I like this better than me talking. Yes, sir.
I know that in that particular century that Hebrews did use that translation quite a bit. In fact, Jesus quoted it. So he's a good witness, you could say, that's accurate.
All right. All right, what else? It's like, Matt, the board's full. I don't want to cut anybody off. This is great. We know more about the Septuagint, than one might expect. So this is good. All right, so some high-level stuff, kind of like we have talked about, it is named from the Latin 70. It's abbreviated LXX. It's a secondary witness. In other words, a primary witness, we'll get into that now. Primary witness would be the Hebrew copied from the Hebrew. Secondary witness would be something once removed from that. When we translate something, we're not going to get everything right, so that becomes a secondary witness because it's a translation. It's not the Hebrew. Okay? And there are other secondary witnesses we'll talk about briefly at the very end. Okay? It is used sometimes in our English Bible translations. It is used by the New Testament writers to quote the Old Testament. It's a witness to other works in addition to the Old Testament books. In other words, there are other things that were bundled with the Septuagint at a later date, like the Apocrypha, so on. We do have much earlier manuscripts than we do for the Masoretic text. And we have more complete manuscripts than, what does that say? And more complete manuscripts than the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, so while less trustworthy due to the translation process and a less rigorous copying process, they're still a very helpful tool for determining the original text. So in other words, the copying of the Septuagint, which we'll get into here in a moment on another slide, maybe the next one, they immediately began amending it, immediately began making it closer to the Hebrew. Whereas with like the Masoretic text, John went over how the translation is very, very rigorous, and it just stayed the same to the point of keeping things that they thought were errors in the Hebrew in the text, but maybe making a marginal note. Okay? Thoughts about this? Thoughts, takeaways, reactions, Scott?
What was the environment that made the New Testament writers quote from the Septuagint?
Excellent question. Why would they quote from the Septuagint? Why would they not use the Hebrew? It's superior. Plus, it's the original language. Anybody have any guesses to that?
Greek had become the universal language, and so it became more prolific and spread more quickly by using Greek.
Absolutely. Yeah, Greek was just more common. Greek was just more common. It's what everyone spoke. It's what they understood. So to speak in Hebrew would be strained at best. And there were fewer and fewer people who were speaking Hebrew at this time. It had become, what's the word I want for a language used by learned people only, much like Latin is today. Okay, thoughts on that? Cool. All right. Manuscripts from the Septuagint are 500 years earlier than our earliest Masoretic manuscripts. The Septuagint had a strong, I didn't introduce this slide. Apologize. So, there are claims today that we should use the Septuagint or translation of the Septuagint more so than the Masoretic text. That this secondary witness is actually more accurate. And reasons that could be would be that we do have manuscripts that are earlier. So, the assumption would be that earlier manuscripts equal more accurate manuscripts, right? More accurate, closer to the source witnesses. Okay, and it is true that the Septuagint is used and has had a strong influence on our modern translations. The claim would be that the Jews altered the Old Testament and the Masoretic texts. Matter of fact, the claim would be because of Christianity, they altered the Hebrew to more easily argue against the Christians, that the Septuagint would be just more accurate. Again, that is the claim. We really don't see evidence of that. Again, just remember all these are the claims. The apostles used the Septuagint for quotations. So if the apostles quoted from it, should we use it today? I mean, right? If it was good enough for Paul, then it should be good enough for me, right? What do you think? Scott?
Greek is a dead language.
Okay.
Except modern Greece has a different kind of a Greek language. It's not that same.
Dialect, right? So Greek is a dead language.
Yeah, it's a dead language, and we speak English. So we'd have to be able to understand it in our native tongue
Sure, yeah.
in order to express our faith.
What if we translated the Septuagint into English? Would that be a better source for us?
I'd say yes.
So it might be yes,
If you got a reliable,
if you accurately translated it. Right, right. So there would, and some people they do say that, right? Let me ask this. Does the apostolic use in Jesus' own quotations from the Septuagint authorize everything in the Septuagint as accurately translated from the Hebrew?
it authorizes what they quoted from.
Ooh. We think it authorizes what they quoted from. Whatever they quoted, we think that's accurate. Can we? I don't think we can really go beyond that. To say, well, Paul quoted something and therefore all of it is good, that goes a bit far. And I'll use an extreme example, which I have on a different slide. Oh well, I'm getting ahead of myself. If I flip through a bunch of slides later, it's because you guys are smart and we got ahead of ourselves. So, if you repeat a lie often enough, the people will believe it. That's a rough quote. Who's that from? I know you know it, Mike. Who is that from? It's not Sherlock Holmes. That's close, but no. What empire is that from? Yeah. Where is it from? I think I lip read you correctly. Where is it from? Rome? Well, after Rome. It's from Nazi Germany. It's from Hermann Goering, the head of the propaganda ministry. Is it true? Do we see today lies that are repeated often and then more people end up believing them than not? Yeah, it absolutely happens. And matter of fact, in cognitive psychology, I think, cognitive something, we have a name for that. Maybe I'll pull it up on the slide when I get to it. But we absolutely observe that today. Is everything that came out of Nazi Germany true? What about Hermann Goering? Everything Hermann Goering said was true, because I quoted Hermann Goering, therefore you know that I agree with everything that Nazis' propaganda ministry said. Would that be accurate? Right? So we can't really put that on the apostles either. If the apostles quoted from the Septuagint, and we're going to see that the Septuagint is being used accommodatively here at the beginning of our study. But even so, even if it were an accurate way to talk about it, we can't really say, well, therefore it's all authorized. Good. Majority of early Christian writers used the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So again, these would be more claims to say, yeah, we should use a translation of the Septuagint today. The thing is that most didn't even know Hebrew. The majority of the New Testament quotes of the Old Testament match closer with the Greek translation readings than the Masoretic text. Well, they do. That's just the fact of the matter. So again, the logical extension, or the supposedly logical extension of that, is, oh, well, we should all use the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament rather than the Masoretic text. Oh, I meant to hit this. Okay. And we already talked about, you guys told me, absolutely correct, it's not just because it was a better translation that the apostles and Jesus used. It could very easily have been that was the language the people spoke and what they heard in synagogue. And therefore, it was easier to relate to the people. And it was accurate in the places that they translated it. And actually, we see it being tweaked just a little bit in some of the quotations, perhaps to be more accurate, perhaps to make the point better. Okay, let's see here. If the apostles and early Christian writers used the Septuagint, we really have covered all of that. The thing is, though, when we say the Septuagint, we're using a 4th century term, as I believe was alluded to earlier by Micah. We're using a term we're using a definition of canon that came much later. Definition, I shouldn't say of canon. We're using a definition of what the Apocrypha included that came much later. So let's go back. In the letter of Aristeas, 2nd century BC, is the earliest mention of the Septuagint translation that we have. That's pretty old. That's 2nd century before Christ. And so he tells the story of the... Okay, so let's do a little history real quick. The southern kingdom was taken into captivity by what empire? Babylonian, right? And then what empire took the Babylonian Empire over? Medo-Persian Empire. Who took the Medo-Persians over? Who conquered? Greece, right? Ptolemy is during the time when after Alexander the Great, that Greek guy, had already died, and then his generals fought it out among themselves, and they ended up with 4 generals who then fought it out some more, and they ended up with the Ptolemies, who ruled in Egypt, and the Seleucids, who ruled in the Syrian area. Thank you. So north of Israel's traditional territory. Okay, so that's who Ptolemy II is. So he's before Christ, 2nd century, and the story is that he wants a copy of the Pentateuch. What's the Pentateuch? First 5 books of the Bible. That's right. We're not talking, not only are we not talking about the Apocrypha, we're not talking about the prophets, we're not talking about the Psalms, Proverbs, we're not talking about Ruth, we're not talking about the prophets, the major or minor prophets. We're talking about the law. So he recruits 72 translators, later just called the 70. Supposedly 6 translators from each tribe sent by the high priest in Jerusalem, bringing the best copies of Scripture, completing this translation in 72 days, 72 scholars, 72 days, and supposedly was an excellent and sacred and accurate translation. I believe the letter of Aristeas was also the one that said that Ptolemy made sure for integrity's sake that all the scholars were locked in a separate room and did their translations separately of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Have you guys read those books? Like, that's a lot to translate in 72 days. And they all did it individually. And when they compared the 72 copies, they, word for word, were exactly the same. It's going to surprise you to know that this is kind of looked at as fantastic, as a stretch, somewhat legendary and embellished. And also, there are several historical inaccuracies in the rest of his letter. Okay, so all other accounts do agree with certain points. And here are John's references for that. But they agree that it was Ptolemy, that it happened in Alexandria, and that there were 70 to 72 translators. And that they only translated the first 5 books of Moses. That's our scope of translation originally. So we're going to get into something in a moment that I may forget to explain called the Old Greek, That's going to be with these first 5 books. That's going to be the oldest translations that they had. So when I think of the Septuagint, I don't think of just the law. I think of the whole Old Testament plus the Apocrypha. All right, so let's talk about the Old Greek. Soon after the initial translation of the Pentateuch, all other Old Testament books were translated into Greek, probably before the 1st century AD, because we see most of them being referred to by that point in time. Even before all books were translated, there were retranslations of the books. They were going back and trying to get the Greek more in line with the Hebrew that they had at the time, the Old Hebrew they had. Some of these translations were more word for word. The Pentateuch, the original, the first, very word for word, very literal, very high level of accuracy as far as we can tell. When we get into Job and the rest of it, especially Job, is more paraphrase for paraphrase. That's what paraphrastic is, right? So thought for thought. Any thoughts or questions on that? There we go then. Revisions. Okay, the 3. Okay. So timeline-wise, we have the original translation, supposedly commissioned by Ptolemy. And then we have that Pentateuch being updated and revised, and as others are translated into Greek, we have that being updated and revised continuously throughout this time period. And those updates were done by scribes whose names we don't know. All right, they're anonymous. However, we do know 3 names, 3 big names that came to light after the initial time of updating the Septuagint. All right, and we have them in chronological order. Theodotion, 40 BC. He was a Jewish Greek reviser of the Old Greek. He took a mostly literal approach in his translations. Don't blame John for this. This is my comparison, kind of like the New King James or ESV. It tries to go word for word, but there are places where it just doesn't fit, and you have to do some translation and word rearranging because definitions don't line up and that kind of thing. This almost exclusively attests to the Proto-Masoretic texts. So his revisions are very, very much in line with the Masoretic text. What do we mean by Proto-Masoretic text? I got a head shake. Yeah, Proto is like an early version of. So whatever came before the Masoretic text, we don't have it. But we can see that this lines up very much with the Masoretic text, and that the different translation choice or the different word choices are in line with what is in the Masoretic text and probably what came before it. So that's the idea of Proto-Masoretic text, which again is the Hebrew. Aquila, we have AD 130, so we've just skipped to 40 years before Christ to well past when our scriptures were being written. And he says, it says this is a Greek reviser of the Old Greek. So same, right? They're all revising the Old Greek. And he's this got an ultra literal translation. Think NASB. There's some places in the NASB where it's so literal, I have to really go back and reread it a number of times to figure out, okay, what does this mean in my English? Because it is really favoring what the original language says more than how we would say it in English. And so that was Aquila's translation style. Symmachus, AD 200, also revised the Old Greek. He had more of a dynamic translation approach, more like the NIV. And all 3 of these, you notice this bullet point is the same. They all attest to the Proto-Masoretic text. So if you're following more of the nuances of this discussion, this is interesting because it supports the Masoretic text. So we have this argument, well, we should go with the Septuagint. But really, when we look at the revisions and we get into the weeds and details, we see that it really kind of supports the Masoretic text. So going strictly to the Septuagint may not be the way to go. All right. To me, this is like a cool supporting evidence detail here. Origen had a 6-column Old Testament. John's mentioned this before. It includes the Hebrew in Greek letters, the 3, which would be, we just talked about these 3 revisers of the Septuagint. That's the 3. And the Old Greek. It also brings notice to other Greek translations, the 5th and 6th. We don't have a lot of these works today. Matter of fact, Origen's document is the evidence we have for a lot of what we're talking about right now. It would have been a huge undertaking. Some doubt if it could have even been copied as a whole. If the Greek lacked the text, he would add text from one of the 3, usually Theodotion, to bring the Greek into alignment with the Old Hebrew. So if you remember, Theodotion was the oldest one that we had up here. Okay, that's Origen's hexapla. So it would look something like this. You'd have all of these columns of each of these. Here's the Hebrew on the left. See if I can read that on the transliteration, column 2. Aquila, column 3. Symmachus, column 4. Septuagint, column 5. Theodotion, column 6. So it would be kind of hard to read, but great to study. All right, so there are actually many Greek translations. In other words, there's not just one Septuagint. John?
Now, when you say Old Greek, you're talking about the common Greek, I believe, the Koine Greek?
It's not.
Common language.
This is a group of documents. The Old Greek refers, and here it refers not to the type of language, but to the older copies of the Septuagint. So, yes, it's a different discussion. Okay. Good question. That was a good question. All right. Scott?
How would somebody who put that 6-column thing together get funded to do all
Well,
that?
I don't know that it's recorded how he did it. I mean, we can speculate, but it would take a lot of funding. It would be significant.
I'm just wondering, is it made by the church or something? I'm just curious.
Yeah, we don't know.
I imagine that's like labor of love for a whole lifetime.
Yeah, it is like a labor of love for a whole lifetime.
Some rich people would have translations for their own use
Right,
to be made.
right.
Imagine it was paid that way.
Yeah, you might have a patron.
A lot of time.
Might have a patron that commissioned the work. Could have been his hobby. Working. Yeah, I don't know. I should know more about that. That's probably something I should Google, but I didn't get that detail. But it would have been a major expense, so good point. All right, so there were actually many Greek translations. While many exist in fragment, we can see the differences in approach similar to some of our Bible translations today, which we talked about. In the 1st century AD, the Septuagint was still just the Pentateuch. So, when our New Testaments were being written, when the church was starting, the Septuagint was still just the Pentateuch. There were many Greek and other Greek translations. So, all right. So what we're going to see here is that the term Septuagint begins to expand over the centuries. In AD 150, in his dialogue with Tropho, Justin Martyr alludes to Isaiah as part of the translation of the 70. So before that, it would have been just the first 5 books. Now he's saying, well, in the translation of the 70, well, that's the Septuagint, you had Isaiah. Well, Isaiah didn't come till much later. Justin Martyr also alludes to Ezra, Psalms, Jeremiah as under the Septuagint umbrella. Irenaeus, about 180, marching forward in time here, in his Against Heresies, calls the Septuagint an inspired translation. Okay. And he adds other ideas to the account of the translation, the original translation of the Septuagint. Instead of the, okay, well, here's where I got that then. I apologize. It was not in the letter that we studied or kind of brought into the discussion at the beginning. It's Irenaeus in 180. That working in 72 separate rooms, they produce that single translation. So I correct that. Origen, early 3rd century AD. Now we're expanding out into the Apocrypha. Susanna, but not Tobit and Judith, is part of the translation of the 70. All right, so he understands the differences in some of these books. He says, and forsooth, when we notice such things, we are forthwith to reject as spurious the copies in use in our churches, and enjoin the brotherhood to put away the sacred books current among them, and to coax the Jews and persuade them to give us copies which shall be untampered with and free from forgery. Are we to suppose that the providence which in the sacred scriptures has ministered to the edification of all the churches of Christ had no thought for those bought with a price, for whom Christ died? So he's seeing some differences between different parts of the Apocrypha, even though he's accepting some of it. So why would there be differences between the Hebrew and Septuagint in the early 3rd century? After all we've discussed, what are your thoughts? Fred?
I think in part time. I mean, when the original Septuagint of the copying of the Pentateuch, or translating the Pentateuch, and some of the apocryphal books may not have even been around at that point. They came later. So they couldn't be added originally because they weren't there. They didn't exist at that time.
Yeah.
And as we saw, they kind of became, some of them, more accepted among certain groups. As time passed.
Time has a way of changing things, John.
Yeah, time does make a difference, especially in your languages. Your languages often evolve, like we don't speak King's English anymore. We speak our own American, which is
Yeah.
a combination of quite a few different languages after us.
Yeah. Yep. So the language changes over time. I saw another hand, Scott.
Wasn't there some political or some kind of environment going on at the time where in the 3rd century the Jews were not happy with the Christians, and so they just didn't feel like the Septuagint was a reliable translation.
Yeah, the Jews used the Septuagint early on, but then they began backing off of it as the Christians embraced it wholeheartedly. Yeah. And so there is a thing there, right? Yeah, okay. Yeah, and also, I brought a show and tell. In the beginning here, I have a preface. I have an inspired preface that God inspired for the New King James Version. And if I skip past all of these books in the middle here, I get to the back, and I've got a concordance, an abbreviated concordance that was inspired. And then after that, I didn't buy it for this, but it was the only version just like my previous Bible, and it happened to have this. So here I have here, Vine's Concise Expository, Dictionary of Biblical Words. So as you guys know, everything in the covers of this codex are inspired. And we know better. And they knew better. But over time, if it was in the covers, well, that's great-great-grandpa's Bible. Well, okay, well, if it was good enough for great-great-grandpa, then it must be Scripture. And that's how these things evolve over time as well. Oh, Also, thought-for-thought translations can turn into the telephone game. Not near as bad as, maybe that example. But that is a thing. It's easier to read. It consolidates information. It's simpler, but sometimes it's not as accurate. The Torah, again, rarely translated phrase for phrase. The prophets and the sacred writings, most likely translated paraphrastically. And so the prophets are like in the middle. It's more likely for a scribe to say, oh, I know what this means, so I'll just say it in Greek. But the law, don't touch it. It's going to be word for word. Okay, and then the additions to Esther and Daniel. Like the age of Moses, the names of the magicians, Jannes and Jambres. We see these details that don't appear in the Masoretic text. But again, if it was quoted by the apostle, must have been accurate. Must have been accurate enough to give us the information that we need and make the points they were making in those passages. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that every midrashic addition was authorized by the apostles. Okay. We talked about it would be hard for generations later to know. Well, if it's there, is it not inspired? Is it not part of the canon? But Origen, who knew that these existed as tradition outside Scripture, he says the answer is that they hid from the knowledge of the people as many of the passages which contained any scandal against the elders, rulers, and judges as they could, some of which have been preserved in uncanonical writings. So this is in a letter that he wrote, and he's saying they were included in the books, but they weren't read out loud. And again, we're not talking about the Hebrew Scripture. We're talking about the Greek translation that would have been passed around among the Jews. Not until the invention of the codex, or the book, is it that large amounts of works could be combined. Prior to the 4th century, you could only have a combination of several works. So you might have Nehemiah and Ezra together, but that's about as long as it's practical to make that scroll. When I can put as many sheets of paper together as I want to, well, now I can bundle a lot more books. It's only in these later centuries that we begin to have the problem that more things are bundled together, confusing whether or not they're part of the canon or not. All right. Does this happen today? You guys remember photo albums? Anybody have antique photo albums at home? I got some for my wedding, so I don't know what that says. Yeah. And now today, like how many photos would you generally have in your possession in the age of photo albums?
You mean in shoeboxes? I have no idea.
Yeah. Well, let's estimate. Hundreds? Maybe 500? Maybe 1,000. What do we have in our phones backed up in the cloud? Thousands plural, right? Maybe tens of thousands. Everything we've eaten for the last decade and a half since smartphones came out. We store a lot more information when we have the ability to easily store it, and they did too. They did the same thing we do. And so as the technology advanced, they put more things together. I heard a bell, and that was rather interesting. All right. What we're going to see here is that there's a two-tiered canon. Not all books had the same level of authority attached to them. Also, there's a difference between what's in the manuscripts and what's in a list of canon. They don't consider everything in the manuscripts to be authoritative. We see a division between Augustine and Jerome. I almost thought we were going to talk about that a moment ago when we talked about the climate that existed at the time. In the 4th century, the climate that existed was the church was leaning more and more toward including more and more Scripture, more and more of these works as Scripture. And Jerome says, no, I can read the Hebrew and it's not there. And we shouldn't include it. And Augustine and others said, no, we should. All right. Again, as we have these books, the Codex or book, Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus, they have more and more in them because they could, not necessarily because it was authoritative. Okay, so the Septuagint today is not the Septuagint of the past. It was initially just the first 5 books, then taken as the Old Greek, so that's what we mean by Old Greek, and now any Greek Old Testament. There were many different translations into the Greek. The differences between the Septuagint and Masoretic text was that some of them were paraphrastic or phrase by phrase translations. There was more copyist error in the Septuagint because, again, when they got down to different works that they didn't think were as important, they tended more toward a more casual translation. And it had some Midrashic additions, which the Masoretic text would not. The additional books now included in the Septuagint were not grouped together until the 5th century AD, so much later. Okay? So, in summary, no, the Septuagint is probably not the source where we would go, oh, this is the best source to know what the Old Testament was like. So what benefit is it? You guys love my thought questions. I can see the look on your face. Fred? It's early. We have some really early witnesses. They're secondary witnesses, but they're early. Yeah, and we can know how the people were thinking and get some insight into how they viewed Scripture and additional witnesses, additional like backup for the Masoretic text itself as well. Absolutely. So beneficial, very beneficial. And I tell you what, I saw a quote. Maybe I heard about the quote. But anyway, I said the Bible is one of the few works where we can know more about it the farther away from the originals we get. Because we have more and more witnesses to what it originally was. That's pretty cool. That really is insightful to me. Okay. Old Latin. So we're talking about Jerome. Old Latin appears to be translated from the Greek. Now, if you think about it, this is a translation of a translation. So this would be that third witness, that tertiary witness. Most occur after 450, and we have only fragments from that time for some time after that. And Jerome complained that among Latins there are as many text forms as there are books, and everyone has either added or subtracted whatever seems right to him according to his own judgment. He's frustrated with the sources that he's translating from. Jeremy?
When you say the Old Latin, so it's translating the...
So Jerome was translating into Old Latin. Yeah. Jerome was translating the Septuagint into Old Latin.
I don't think that's accurate.
What is accurate?
Old Latin is Latin translations that existed before. Jerome is the one complaining about them.
Oh, about the Latin sources. Okay. So then the Latin he would be translating into would be...
Latin Vulgate is his work.
Right.
So it's the later thing. Old Latin is just any Latin translations that existed before.
So how does that then relate to the Septuagint? It's just that that Old Latin...
That they used Greek as their basis for translating.
Okay.
I remember there being something about Jerome. People were criticizing him for choosing to use Hebrew as the basis for the Vulgate instead of using the Septuagint. He's like, no, I want to use the Hebrew.
Okay. That makes sense, what he said. Did you everybody hear what he said? So they're taking... He's complaining about Jerome is complaining about the Old Latin and the sources that they had for the Scripture among the Old Latin. because of all these additions and changes. And the Old Latin would have been from the Greek sources, we think, because of word choices, etc. And then Jerome then chose to go back to the Hebrew instead of going through the Septuagint or even the Old Latin sources that he had. So he wanted to go back to as old an original as he could get to.
So that would be like a Masoretic, like a word for word of the Jewish, or
That's what he's attempting, yes. Now exactly which Hebrew he's going back to, we don't have that I know of, Micah, okay. We don't know exactly which Hebrew. And that's kind of the reason that Jerome's translation is helpful, which we might as well go to the Latin Vulgate there slide, is because he had Hebrew that maybe we don't have access to today. So that's the Latin Vulgate. All right. I'm pretty sure I heard the second bell. So what we will do, really we have a very similar synopsis of the other translations that are available. The Aramaic Targums, the Syriac. Again, they're witnesses of witnesses. We can kind of, by extension, know what was helpful. They are helpful to confirm the Hebrew Old Testament because they all kind of point back to the same Hebrew Old Testament. So we wouldn't use them instead of the Hebrew Old Testament, but we can use them to confirm the Hebrew Old Testament. All right. So the final word is, while less trustworthy due to the translation process and a less rigorous copying process, they're still very helpful for determining the original text. Yep, so that's what we talked about. This coming Sunday, John Bias will not be back yet. John Christian will be teaching, and you will be teaching on?
Going to look at alleged contradictions in Scripture.
Alleged contradictions in Scripture. So kind of going along with confirming the Scripture that we have and how we approach those contradictions. So kind of a one-off bonus material till John gets back. So thank you very much.